Okay, so let's start with our closing lecture. So it's an honor for me to present you María Loroño, who is from the Basque Center for Climate Change. She's a postdoc researcher at the Basque Center for Climate Change as part of the European Research Council project Imagine Adaptation. She's interested in designing environmentally sustainable and socially just cities, as well as climate governance and citizen participation. And she has a background in communication, public relations, and psychology. And she is passionate about science communication, and she has participated in multiple science festival and public events. She also really enjoys visual communication, and she's currently writing about qualitative data visualization. So, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a real honor to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation to participate, to close this face-to-face part of the course. And thank you so much for everyone to coming and joining here. I don't know if you can hear me properly. Is it okay? Yes? Okay. So I've had the opportunity to speak to a couple of you before coming here, and I've realized that you've got very diverse backgrounds. So today I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about how our cities are changing, and I'm going to do that from the perspective of climate change and adaptation to climate change. And thinking about how it is really important to consider different views, different backgrounds, different cultures when we plan for our cities to be adapted to climate change. So I don't know how many of you here in the room have any connection with climate change and adaptation. Are you, like any of you, studying this as a master's or as a PhD? Maybe if you can raise your hands if you do. Okay, so most of you don't study this. So I'm going to try to explain every concept as we go along, and if you have any questions or if there is anything new that I haven't explained properly or something that you don't understand, I'm really happy if you stop me and I can clarify. Before we start, I really hope that you've enjoyed this week and that you've managed to talk to each other and get all the knowledge and values and everything that is happening in the room with different backgrounds. I am from Bilbao and I'm working at the BC3, as Frederick said. But before that, I studied my master's in Copenhagen with loads of people from different parts of the world. And then from there, I moved to do my PhD in Manchester, in the Manchester Metropolitan University, and also with loads of colleagues from around the world. So I know that that was one of my most enriching experiences in my life. And I did my undergraduate in Bilbao, in the UPV, so the same as this, but in the campus in Vizcaya. So now I'm back after a few years living abroad, and I'm back in the Basque Country. I'm back in Bilbao, and I'm back in the university, or the BC3. And I'm part of a project called Imagine Adaptation, which is a European-funded project. It's 5 years, so it's quite a long project for research, as research projects are. And the goal of this project is to, on the one hand, define or redefine what adaptation to climate change is, but from the bottom up, so considering the local realities and how local experts define adaptation, and also to start thinking a little bit about how we can measure and evaluate adaptation, because the only way to progress is to know if what we are doing is working. So, our cities are changing, but this is not something that is new. I mean, you all know that cities change. Cities constantly change. That's the very nature of cities. But there's been huge changes for cities in the last few years. You know, climate change is one of them. But we've all experienced, regardless of where we come from, we've all experienced a world pandemic. So the way cities change are often in overlapping layers. There are multiple changes happening at the same time. Sometimes, if you want to call them a crisis, compound crises happening together. But today I want to focus more on the part of climate change and how climate change affects and changes cities. This is, unfortunately, a photograph that probably many of us have seen in the recent few years. This was taken in Bilbao, and this is an example of extreme temperatures, of heat. And heat changes cities, not just because it can have a huge impact on infrastructure, like it can lead to water scarcity or droughts, but also changes the life of people and the well-being of people in cities. So it changes infrastructures, but also the health of people and ecosystems as well. Another example here, also a very common photograph. This is taken in Zarautz, which is in the Basque country, in Gipuzkoa. Some of you said you were going to go to San Sebastian, so this is very close to that. And this is a way more visual impact of how climate change changes our cities or destroys parts of our cities. So flooding, of course, will have an impact in infrastructure, breaking down infrastructure, but also delays in transport system, road networks, but also huge impact on the livelihood of people, on their businesses, on their homes, and even their health, not just the physical health, but like the emotional health, the well-being of people that go through these type of experiences. And I wanted to also mention a little bit about migration and how both these impacts that we've seen of climate change and others end up pushing people away from their homes, from their neighborhoods, from their towns and cities, and even countries. So another way that cities are changing is through the movement of people, which changes the population numbers, changes the demands on key infrastructure, but also changes the culture within cities. Cities in Europe are already very diverse, but through migration, because of climate change, this is happening even more. So there is even more mix of cultures and people meeting together. But cities are not only changing because they are being impacted by climate change. Cities are also changing because we need to change cities in order to adapt to climate change. So for example, many cities around the world are choosing to become greener, are choosing to use green infrastructure to be able to overcome the challenges presented by climate change. We are in Vitoria. Vitoria was green capital, you probably all know that, I think it was in 2012. And Vitoria is doing huge efforts to become greener. Every time I come, I think the city is greener. They've done an amazing work by recuperating the wetlands. I don't know if you have seen it in Salburua, but that is a really interesting adaptation project. I think most of you are living, so I don't know if you haven't seen it, you won't have time, but maybe for next time it's really interesting. And also there are very many projects trying to green the city. So like, for example, in school yards, trying to make school yards greener by collaborating with the students, by asking them what they want to see in their schools, and also within housing blocks, greening all the inside of the houses. So Vitoria is doing really, really interesting projects in relation to green space. Of course, the photo had to be from Bilbao because I'm from Bilbao. And green infrastructure has really good impacts in the environment. It helps with regulating temperatures because it provides shades, because it takes water, makes all the environment around be cooler, but also helps with flooding because asphalt or cement cannot take water in, but green infrastructure can. But interestingly, it also has really good positive impacts for people. So people who live around green space, they are happier, they are healthier, they normally practice more sports, they have spaces where they can meet, they can gather, so improves the social cohesion between people. This is another example of how we are changing cities. We are not creating new infrastructure, but we are changing the existing infrastructure. So there are a lot of projects happening about building retrofitting, which is basically trying to change the existing buildings so that they become, for example, cooler when there is a heat wave. There are two main ways of doing that. One is using green infrastructure, so covering the roofs with leaves or the facade of the house. But there's also a tendency to start painting the roofs in white, for example, trying to replicate a Greek village where everything is white, because white doesn't attract heat. And there's been a really interesting debate in Paris in relation to this about adaptation and identity. So the photo there is one of the very iconic buildings in Paris with the zinc roofs. And they are gorgeous, but they attract a lot of heat and they keep the heat inside. So they need to be able to figure out how to change this. They could make them green, they could make them white, but then they are no longer the iconic Parisian buildings. So often changing cities and adapting cities is also trying to consider the identity of a place. How can we adapt and keep the identity? Do we need to keep the identity if it is to overcome the challenges of climate change? So this is quite an interesting debate. Similar kind of experience is the climate shelters. I don't know whether you are familiar with this term, but it's basically changing the use of existing spaces and buildings in a city. This is an example also from Bilbao. This is the Ribera Market, and this is a public space where people are invited to go when it is extremely hot. And these type of buildings work for extreme weathers, both hot and cold. And usually are public spaces like libraries, museums, shopping centers, where people are welcome. They have a sign outside saying this is a climate shelter, and people are welcome to come and join in order to feel better about the temperature outside. Of course, these sort of places need to be carefully thought. They need to be all around the city. They cannot just be in the city center because it needs to be for everyone. And also, it's interesting to think about the typology of these places. So how do we select these places? If we say all shopping centers are climate shelters, then there might be people who don't feel welcome to these places because they are surrounded around consumerism. So there needs to be a typology of places. And this is the last example that I have in relation to how adaptation changes cities. And it's in relation to everyday adaptation or tactical urbanism. I don't know if you're familiar with these terms, but it doesn't matter. It's just a reference to informal responses to adaptation. So it's not something that is government-led. It's not something that the town hall is planning. It's more like communities themselves see that they need to have a shade somewhere because it's too hot, so they take it upon themselves to create that shade. So it could be by hanging umbrellas, it could be done by using seats in the house, or it could be by creating big planters that might accumulate water somehow. And the interesting aspect of this way of doing adaptation is that it's led by the community, so it normally has a very strong sense of identity. It really represents the communities that are behind these adaptation measures. So we've seen many different ways of how cities change because of climate change and how we respond to that by changing cities further. But all of these ways of doing adaptation, for them to be effective and for them to be successful, they need to have something in common, and is that they need to include multiple knowledges. They need to be designed and they need to be implemented, but taking into consideration very different perspectives and knowledge and needs of people. And you could even think that if we engage in this exercise and we agree that multiple knowledge is necessary and we try to implement this, then we are changing our cities further by changing the governance system of cities. It's a little bit more less visible. It's not like changing a building or creating a park, but it is system change. So what happens when we say, yes, multiple knowledge is really important and we need to use this knowledge in order to change our cities and build the cities of the future? We end up deglobalizing adaptation. It's true that adaptation is a global issue, it's a global concept. All cities need to adapt. But that doesn't mean that adaptation has to happen from the global level to the local. Adaptation needs to be designed and it needs to be defined at the local level by the people who are going to experience those adaptation measures. So when we say multiple knowledges are necessary, and we engage the people and different communities, we immediately deglobalize adaptation, and we create adaptation that is locally relevant. We were talking about how cities are already very multicultural and how climate change is taking that farther because there is more migration, and so there are more cultures happening, in more cultures living together in a city. And adaptation works to protect cultural heritage, so tangible cultural heritage. We don't want our buildings to be damaged, we don't want our bridges to be damaged, but we also work towards protecting the intangible cultural heritage. So if communities need to migrate and need to leave their neighborhoods and their towns, there are cultural practices, languages, theater, storytelling that might be lost. So adaptation tries to protect cultural heritage. But also, for adaptation to be effective, for adaptation to incorporate multiple knowledges, it needs to engage with this cultural heritage. It needs to understand what cultures are living together in a city. What are these practices? And even use these practices in order to adapt to climate change. We were talking about tactical urbanism, we were talking about community-led adaptation. Maybe through these cultural practices, we can actually adapt in a way that keeps the identity of a neighborhood. Intersectionality. Also, I don't know whether you're familiar with this concept or not, but when we say that we need the knowledge of the people who live in a town, in a city, in a neighborhood, we also need to be aware that there are existing structural vulnerabilities. So not everyone is going to have the same experience in a city, not everyone is going to experience the consequences of climate change in the same way, and not everyone is going to benefit from the same adaptation measure in the same way. So for example, I wrote my thesis, my PhD thesis, in relation to how women perceive the city and perceived air pollution. So for example, if you take the idea of safety in a city, the perception of safety is going to change the way you travel around at night, for example. So this is one category, women. But then you can add to this. It's not the same to be a white woman or a woman of color, or a woman that belongs to an LGBT plus community, or a woman who has a disability. So it is this intersection of demographic traits that build this network of vulnerabilities. And just by addressing this, by realizing that this is how cities are constructed, how cities are, then you start to break these vulnerabilities because you start engaging all of these people at different intersections within adaptation and the building of cities. And of course, if we say multiple knowledges are important, what we are saying is that citizens need to participate in the governance of cities. This would make the process of adaptation more democratic, and it would also make that the policies that are developed, the adaptation measures that are created, are more effective because they are considering the experiences and the needs of the people who are involved. How are we getting on? Good? Yes? Easy to follow? Okay. So this is all very good. Knowledge co-production is great. We need knowledge co-production. We need multiple knowledges. But how do we do that? You know, there are a lot of challenges linked to knowledge co-production. But today I want to focus on two of those. The first one is about knowledge hierarchies. So we decide that we want to open up the governance process. We want to invite loads of people, different voices, people who have expert knowledge, technical knowledge, and also knowledge based on the experience, the experience of citizens. And we bring everyone together, but traditionally, always there's been a power imbalance because there is a very deeply held belief that technical and scientific knowledge is more important than experiential knowledge. And simply by that, there are already hierarchies in the room. Also, the people who have the experiential, the technical and scientific knowledge, the expert knowledge, are normally more practiced at participating in these processes, at being part of governance processes, so they are better at articulating their views. People who are based on, who are coming there based on their own personal experience, probably, and it would make sense, that they have less experience in participating in these processes. So again, there is a power imbalance. And also, what we need to do based on everything that I've been talking about is including vulnerable populations, not just the population as a whole, but make sure that every vulnerable population is included, which again might bring even more power imbalances, because these people might be people who have experienced the consequences of climate change firsthand, or they've experienced an adaptation measure that has gone extremely wrong. So there are power imbalances. And also, there is something called a crisis of the imagination. And what that means is that we are not able to imagine the future of the cities. So if you can't imagine the future of the city, how are you going to even design these cities? How are you even going to talk about what you want in these cities? You don't know what you want in these cities. Like, it's really difficult to think about these things. Just very quickly, if you can close your eyes and choose the city, either the city you come from, the city that is most at heart to you, the city that most represents you, and try to think, how do you think that city is going to look in the future if we are adapting that city to climate change? 2 seconds. So normally, when I do this exercise, people respond by either picturing a complete utopia. Everything is green, all buildings are futuristic, everything is perfect, everyone's happy. Or maybe some of you have thought of a scenario of disaster like loss and damage, doomsday, end of the world. And this is because we are able to imagine what we see through films, books, paintings, and what films, sci-fi films have shown us is that the future is either green and utopia, is a technology-dominated future where everything runs through technology and everything is on time and everything is perfect, or everything is a disaster. There isn't that much more in between. If we take the example when COVID happened, I don't think many of us were able to imagine that it was going to become a world pandemic affecting everyone. And even if you did manage to imagine that, when we've seen scenarios and films of like pandemics, and what we see is chaos in the street. I don't know if you're watching The Eternaut, but it's just cars being piled together, empty supermarkets, everything is like in the floors, everything is a disaster. No one in the street. But the city is not a tidy city. But actually, when COVID happened, this wasn't like that. It was just a very perfect, quiet, empty city. So it's very difficult to imagine the future. And this is when creative methods come in. So creative methods are a way to tie everything together. We can visualize our cities, we can adapt our cities, and we can engage multiple knowledges through these methods. They are a tool for creative thinking. So we were saying we are able to imagine green utopias, technology, and disaster because that's what we have seen. So if we manage to create a visual library of alternative futures, and we are able to see those visual materials, we might be able to start reflecting about what sort of future we want. It's also a tool for knowledge co-production, in the sense that it brings, we were talking about how they are knowledge hierarchies when we come together to co-create knowledge. So creative methods bring an extra element to that, and it manages to break these hierarchies. Take any creative artistic method you want. It doesn't belong in the lab. and it doesn't belong generally in the street. No one in the room, or most people in the room, will not master that technique, and therefore levels out all existing hierarchies and knowledge. There is quite an interesting example that happened in the UK in Pickering. They were struggling with flooding, and there was a knowledge co-production session with the environmental agency, the local council, researchers, local populations. And so they met in a room to talk about how they could deal with flooding in that town. And in order to break down these existing knowledge hierarchies, they asked everyone to bring an object that connected themselves to the flooding. And so the experts brought flood maps and reports and measuring tools. And one of the affected communities brought a piece of a moldy carpet. And so simply by introducing that idea, that creative method of bringing objects, it suddenly connected everyone to the issue of flooding, and actually situated the affected community much stronger by saying, I have experienced this, what did you bring, a report, much strongly to the case at hand. Creative methods can also be a very good tool to engage with sensitive topics. So they allow to open up emotions, they allow to talk about loss and damage, and sometimes, unfortunately, when we do adaptation, there is always a risk of maladaptation. Maladaptation is just unintended negative effects of adaptation measures, and it can happen because we didn't quite understand how the adaptation measure was going to work, we didn't calculate that outcome, or also because we didn't include enough communities in the design, and so it has a negative consequence in one specific community. Examples of maladaptation could be in relation to green gentrification. So we green a neighborhood, it becomes really desirable, everyone wants to go and move there, and then the people who actually have lived in that community for their entire life cannot afford the housing, cannot afford the prices of the businesses around, and they have to leave. Or a protection to flooding. We say, oh, we've got an issue with flooding here, let's build a wall, we are all protected and safe, but the river becomes much stronger and then affects extra hard to the next community along in the valley. So these things are not done knowingly. It's not, oh, we'll be okay, they won't be, but we don't care. It's that you weren't able to predict the consequences of the adaptation measure. And being able to use creative methodology and creative methods allow us to engage at this level, engage with vulnerable communities, with affected communities, and talk about loss and damage in a much easier way than a normal interaction would be. And the creative methods can be a really good tool for contextualization. So we all know that art is read differently by different people. So the same tool can be applied in very many different communities, and everyone in that community is going to be able to attribute their own values, their own meaning, their own experiences to the same methodology. So it's about making it super relevant at the local context and bringing in loads of voices through the advantage of interpretation. But what are creative methods? So here are some examples. For example, there is a very common technique called photo voice. I don't know if you are familiar with it, but it's about asking people to take photos of their life in the weeks, for example, leading up to a workshop. And so if you want to know how people struggle with heat waves, you ask them to take photos of the times in the day when they are most hot. It might be when they are cooking, it might be when they are sleeping, it might be when they take photos of their routines. Or, for example, if they struggle with temperature outside the house and they need to walk from home to the workplace, they can take photos of the areas of the city where they struggle most. And so by analyzing these photos, you have a window into their lives that it might be really difficult to articulate because actually you don't know when it is that is the most challenging. Or it might allow you to bring in people with different educational levels, or it might allow you to bring people that do not speak the language, but they are able to take photographs. Same with using the technique of a collage. It's quite difficult to articulate how you imagine the city in the future or how you are affected by heat waves. It's difficult to do that. But if you are able to cut and paste loads of different elements that exist in magazines, in reports, you might be able to create something that communicates or helps you communicate that. Same thing with drawing. Sometimes talking about these things is not easy, but you are able to draw. You can use the medium of poetry. When I was doing my PhD, I participated in 2 poetry workshops that were run by my PhD supervisor with a community of migrants and a community of people struggling with mental health issues. And so we were talking about how they experience air pollution in Manchester through the medium of poetry. They weren't asked to talk about their personal experience, or so tell me how you feel, tell me. They were just asked to write a poem. So that takes the pressure away from being able to communicate fully. And then another one that I find really interesting is about creating maps together with people. So instead of bringing a map and saying, this is your neighborhood, asking the people to draw that map. And then suddenly you're going to see what becomes really relevant or what is really important for each person. Somebody will draw the hospital, maybe it's because they need to be going there regularly. Somebody will choose to represent the school in the map because they have kids and this is where they go every day. Maybe somebody chooses to represent the bar, and you see what's really important for the people that have come to that workshop, and you understand the realities much more. Okay, so in order to bring everything together and be able to give you more examples, I want to talk a little bit about the work that we do in Imagine Adaptation. Sorry. So this project started about 2.5 years ago. And one of the things we wanted to do is to redefine what adaptation to climate change is, by asking lots of people in different parts of the world how they imagine their cities in the future. How do they want to adapt their cities? And so we realized, as we've seen today, that there are very limited ways of imagining the future. And so what we did was to start a long process of research in scientific literature, reports, social media, of how adaptation was being talked about, how adaptation was being presented. And so we identified like 100+ concepts in relation to adaptation. And then we did an internal workshop and we went through all the concepts and we looked at everything together. This is related to this is related to that. And at the end, we came up with 31 concepts in relation to adaptation. This is what adaptation is, 31 concepts. And some of them speak to the outcomes of adaptation. So we have green infrastructure, flooding defense, building retrofitting. But we also have things that refer to the process of doing adaptation. It needs to be locally led. It needs to be a transparent government. It needs to be including intersectionality and structural vulnerabilities. And we realized, okay, we've got these concepts that are quite fair. We asked a series of people and experts to check if they thought that covered everything they knew about adaptation. But of course, it's still very difficult to talk about these things, even if they give you names and concepts. So we wanted to be able to use a creative methodology and represent this in a visual form. So we said, okay, let's look at the images that are out there, and we might be able to select images that represent these concepts. And of course, we found green infrastructure, technology, flooding defense, loss and damage, but we weren't able to find much more beyond that. So we soon realized that we needed to work with a local artist to be able to represent all of these concepts in a visual form. So that wasn't a challenge. We had to create briefs for every concept, explaining what they were. We needed to be very careful about what we needed to avoid. These shouldn't represent that. Maybe also talk about the elements that could be incorporated in the visual. We didn't want to use flags, for example, because it's about colonization. We wanted to get away from that. So very specific explanations of what each visual should have. And of course, we wanted for these visuals to be able to be used across the world. So they needed to be anywhere in the world and nowhere in particular. So there was loads of research on street life, architecture, type of trees, what people should you include. So we did that initially with the artist, and then of course we needed to do a pilot of that, ask loads of people around the world to tell us whether the illustration could be understood and whether there was an element out of place. Maybe they found something really offensive. Maybe they found that they couldn't relate to that illustration at all because it wasn't representative of their geographical location. So in order for you to see a little bit the process, I've selected 3 illustrations, and I can show you the sketch and the final. This is one of them. This is urban farming. So you can see that the sketch, this is quite strange because the sketch has way more detail than the final. Normally it's the other way around. And it's because we were quite happy how the architecture looked. We were quite happy about the different types of trees, and we were also quite happy about the different ways of conducting market. You know, sometimes there is a market stall. Some people are selling in the floor. Some people are carrying goods in a bag, others in a wheelbarrow, others in a basket. But then the people, we had to work really carefully so that everyone could be represented in the image. And actually, urban farming is a social thing, you know, it's people who farm and it is for people. So people needed to be represented, but maybe we didn't need that level of detail of each individual person in that visual. So we moved to just choosing stick figures. So the people are there, people are very important for urban farming, otherwise it doesn't happen, but we don't need to talk about their traits, physical traits. This one had a really strong reaction, which we completely didn't anticipate. So this shows how architecture needs to be built taking into consideration the climate risks of a place, yeah? So our sketch shows a house that has very good airflow, very good ventilation, no problem with heat waves, but actually is also standing on water. So there is no floating risk because it goes up and down with the level of the water. This is something that happens in the Netherlands. And so we were quite happy with this illustration, but what happened is that people reacted really strongly, saying this is clearly a Northern European building, and also it's of like really, really rich family, you know? Somebody has how many boats they can park there? And it was like, okay, completely misunderstood. Let's completely forget about that. Focus on the building with the airflows, and we'll just elevate the building to show that there is room for water to go up and down. And then the last one that I want to show you is about cultural heritage. This illustration was really, really difficult to design, and this is one of the ones that people love the most at the moment. This sketch, we clearly focused on tangible cultural heritage. You know, you've got the pyramids, and you've got all the famous buildings and the Eiffel Tower. And we also wanted to kind of show like the tactical urbanism and the everyday adaptation that we were talking about, something that citizens had constructed to protect from the sun, some shaded stuff. And then this one didn't even go out to pilot. We looked at it and it was like, this is really embarrassing. This is so like stereotypical. This is not what we want. And so we had to think again really hard about what is cultural heritage. So we then moved on to saying, okay, we need to focus on cultural heritage that is intangible. We want to make sure that adaptation protects these practices, but also that we include these practices when we do adaptation. And that's why we came up with this kind of visual of like theater and everyone linked together through a string that represents that culture with masks and stuff much better than just buildings of a travel brochure. And I was in Bogota a couple of weeks ago. I was very lucky to be there. In Imagine Adaptation, for the next 3 years, we're going to be working with 12 different cities around the world, and we're going to be working with them to understand how they do adaptation, what are their challenges, and also to see if there is any learnings that we can both take out of these experiences in relation to how they measure the impact of their actions. So one of my case studies is in Bogota. And I was working there with an organization called Fundación Cerros de Bogotá, which is basically an organization that works to protect the cerros, which is the hills around the city. The whole, I don't know if you have been to Bogota, but the whole city, the east side of the city, from north to south, is surrounded by these massive, massive hills. And so the hills have, of course, in terms of environmental impact, clean air for the city, huge key for water provision in Bogota. It's really good for people to go and do hikes, so it keeps people active, it keeps people happy. They all agree that it is very much their identity, you know, as somebody from Bogota, the cerros is your identity, and it helps you orient in the city as well, like you know where you are by looking at the cerros. But what I wanted to do with them was to understand how they thought the connection between the cerros and the city is, and also how they wanted that going forward in the future. Cerros is not just like any mountain like surrounding the city. It is a huge environmental asset, but also there are very many communities living in the cerros, some of which are formal and some of which are informal. So there's a lot of like social structures, tensions happening within that location. And so the idea was to conduct a workshop and to use these illustrations. And I did that in different locations. One of them was directly in the cerros. Some of them were with different communities along the cerros, sometimes with professionals and experts in adaptation, and sometimes with the informal settlements who live in the cerros, the representative of those communities. And so in relation to the illustrations, people got really excited when they saw the illustrations because they could pick something and immediately start talking about their experience with the cerros and how they wanted that to be in the future. They didn't even like consider whether what they were gonna say was good enough or whether it was on point, you know. They just immediately got an illustration and said, oh my God, this represents, you know, straight into giving information. I was very lucky to be able to do this exercise with representatives of these informal settlements, people who would have not been able to engage in a normal interview style back and forth of like, tell me about the future, tell me about how you think the cerros fits with Bogota. And it was, because of the literacy skills, it was really useful to have these illustrations because the same thing happened. They just started talking about what those images meant for them. And then very interestingly, this methodology, this set of cards that we had designed were referred to as tarot cards. And I was like, okay, I understand why. We are talking about the future and we have cards on the table. That's what tarot is, yeah? And then also because there were windows into the future, you know? People couldn't imagine the cities and then suddenly they see something and they go, oh yeah, this is how maybe I imagine my city. So they were like little windows into the future. Maybe also because how much people can interpret these images. I don't think two readings of the same tarot cards are ever going to be the same, so people were interpreting and bringing their own experiences. And I thought it was interesting. First of all, I was like, do you know how much time is gone to calibrate this scientific tool? How much research is being put into designing these illustrations? This is not a tarot card. But then I thought, well, actually, there might be a really interesting metaphor there of how this can be used to talk about the future and think about the future. So yes, just to wrap everything up, and then we can have some questions, and I know some of you need to go places today, so I don't want to be much longer. Our cities have always been changing, but are changing even more. And they are changing as a response to climate change, but also because we are changing these cities so that they can become better places. What did I say? Yes, better places. Where there is more green infrastructure, there is a space for people to engage in exercise, people to meet, people to be more connected. And also it's extremely important to be able to use multiple knowledges. And in order to do that, which is quite difficult, creative methods can allow for this to happen. So the exploration through changing our cities, designing the cities of the future, including multiple voices, can be done through creative methodology. Thank you very much. This is the website of Imagine Adaptation if anybody is interested in going and checking some more. And then those are my LinkedIn and Instagram profiles that I use professionally. So if you want to follow me, that would be amazing. And please feel free to ask any questions.